All right, Ted Cruz, look, we need to talk about your performance Friday night at the Texas Senate debate. I'm not saying you did a terrible job, but it could have been better. By my analysis, at the end of the debate, you were about tied with Beto O'Rourke, and he's kind of a political know-nothing who just spouts left-wing truisms. So you should have destroyed him. And I'm going to try to show you how you could have done that so that your next debate goes more smoothly. Okay, so let's break it down. The Texas Senate debate centered around 10 issues, and those are going to be time-stamped below in case you want to fast forward to those moments in the debate. Those issues were immigration, policing, Judge Kavanaugh, guns and the Second Amendment, and then you had two gotcha questions. The first one was aimed at you and your undignified word battle with Donald Trump back in 2016. And then there was one to Beto about his DUI arrest. And then you had healthcare, trade, and values, and tax cuts. And then, of course, at the very, very end was that moment where you're supposed to compliment each other, which didn't go so well. So let's start with immigration up first. On immigration, you were in something of a tough spot. Texas is a border state, and it has a lot of illegal immigrants. And while most people see illegal immigration in the abstract to be a problem, nobody really wants the illegal immigrant next door to get deported, especially when they know them personally. And similarly, while building a wall can signal seriousness about border security to most Americans, Texas is where most of that wall would get built. And so this kind of allows Beto to play off the fears of Texans on the border who will worry about the federal government's intrusion and eminent domain and all of that other stuff. In the midst of all this, your answer kind of went like this. You did three things. First, you boiled down your position to legal good, illegal bad, which not bad. You also talked about your immigrant parents, which is a good move. And then you dropped the line, Americans are dreamers too. Not terrible, not a terrible response, but I think there was a better way to do this. The line Americans are dreamers too pits American citizens against illegal immigrants. But when discussing immigration in a state with so many immigrants in it, it's better to point out how unfair to the legal immigrants it is for illegal immigrants to jump to the front of the line by crossing the border illegally. You could say something like this. No one who has intentionally broken our laws should get preferential treatment over those who have been working hard and patiently going through the process to become legal citizens. I think this makes your same point, but it brings Americans and legal immigrants to the same side of the issue. Also, and this is important, when Americans vote, they like to feel that they are doing something compassionate. And it is one thing if Texans feel that a vote for you is a vote for the interests of Americans over illegals. It's another better thing if Texans feel that a vote for you is an act of compassion toward legal immigrants. And so I think that's how you should have couched that question in order to bring more people onto your side in what it was admittedly a tricky situation. All right. The next question dealt with racism and police. Here you had the right idea again. You didn't want to give a defensive answer. You wanted to shift the discussion immediately to Representative O'Rourke's radically progressive comments about how modern police forces are the new Jim Crow, something which he did say despite his denial. This was an effective idea, and it did put Beto on the defensive. However, the way you got there was a bit tone deaf, and I'm going to show you why. First off, you were asked about an incident where an innocent black person was killed. And your first response was to call the incident tragic and then to dither about whether or not it was intentional. And then, and this is the more troublesome part, only a minute later in the same answer, you yourself brought up the death of police officers, and then you became morally indignant about it. So what do you feel that you're asked, what do you feel about a black person who was killed? It's tragic, dithering. But police, rah, 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 right? So that's not the best way to look. Look, your answer was not wrong. Basically, you were asked this. Why did you caution Representative O'Rourke and others not to jump to conclusions in this case. That was the question you were given. And your answer was basically, well, because jumping to conclusions causes officers to needlessly die. That answer makes sense. And I get it. As a conservative, I'm on your side on that. However, there's more to a political response than merely how your answer fits logically with the question. It also matters how you look. The audience is judging you not just on the words, they're actually judging you more based on the emotions you show. So when you're asked about Botham Jean and you calmly say, look, what happened is horrific. It was tragic. But then a minute later, you're accusatory and indignant over the unnecessary death of police officers. People notice that change. And it would be one thing if this happened once. It actually happened twice in a row. Right after talking about Botham, you were asked directly whether or not police violence against unarmed African Americans was a problem. And again, you barely addressed the question before going right back to the deaths of police officers. It's worth playing the clip to show you what I mean.
Quick follow-up to you, Senator Cruz. Do you agree that police violence against unarmed African Americans is a problem? And if so, how would you fix it?
I believe everyone's rights should be protected, regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity. But I'll tell you something. I've been to too many police funerals. I was here in Dallas when 5 police officers were gunned down because of irresponsible and hateful rhetoric.
Again, as a conservative, I get your point. You don't believe the Black Lives Matter rhetoric, and you think it gets officers killed. But that's not exactly what's coming across. What's coming across is that you don't really want to talk about Black lives. I'm going to play the moderator's question again, and then I'm going to show you how I think you should have responded.
Do you agree that police violence against unarmed African Americans is a problem? And if so, how would you fix it?
Of course that's a problem. Of course it is. And the hyphens aren't necessary here. These are Americans, full stop, not hyphenated Americans. And when any American is mistreated by the police, that is an injustice felt by the entire American community, not just those who share the person's ethnicity or skin color. I find it extremely troubling that our national unity is so often undermined by those who use reckless rhetoric that encourages minority communities to see the police as their enemy when nothing could be further from the truth. That is why I believe what happened with Officer Geiger is doubly tragic. It is tragic, first of all, because Botham Jean's life is as precious as every other American's life. And that's why my heart goes out to him and his family. And secondly, this particular situation is tragic because it enables opportunistic politicians to turn a tragic mistake and a cause for mourning into yet another opportunity to divide Americans along racial lines. All right, next up is Judge Kavanaugh. Great job on your initial answer on this one. You immediately pointed out that Beto opposes Kavanaugh's confirmation, and you explained that the court issue is one of constitutionalism. That's exactly right. However, after you made this point, Representative O'Rourke took a page out of George Soros's playbook. And in lieu of directly responding to this attack, you jumped to talking about the Supreme Court's Heller decision, and you were trying to tie Beto's liberal activism to opposition to the Second Amendment. Now, that's not a bad play, especially in Texas. But in my opinion, you passed up a bigger win here. I'm going to play Representative O'Rourke's moment, George Soros moment, his whole answer, the Soros moment and how he followed it up. And then after that clip, I'm going to respond how I think you should have responded.
The senator has a troubling history of the kinds of nominees that he's supported. Someone like Jeff Mateer to the federal bench, someone who believes in conversion therapy, who's described transgender children as part of Satan's plan. People like Andrew Oldham, who could not say whether the landmark school integration 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education was correctly decided. People like Brent Talley, who has never tried a case before. Dr. Ford's allegations should be investigated by the FBI, full stop. There's precedent for that. That's the right thing to do given the gravity of the accusations. But the senator is right in this regard. Judge Kavanaugh does not meet the bar for Texas to serve on the Supreme Court in a state that is now 50th in voter turnout. Judge Kavanaugh has a troubling history on voter rights protections. In a state that is the epicenter for the maternal mortality crisis, 3 times as deadly for African American women, Judge Kavanaugh has a troubling history in agreeing that Roe versus Wade is the decided law of the land. And in a state where you can be fired for being gay, his support for civil rights is in question. We need a Supreme Court justice who will decide in favor of people and for their rights that have been established by precedents and under the Constitution. And in Brett Kavanaugh, we do not have that justice.
Representative, that's your time. Senator Cruz.
You know, this is an instructive moment. I've heard many of my liberal friends wonder aloud how evangelicals can overwhelmingly support Donald Trump's presidency. And well, those of you who are listening to my colleague now have your answer. Liberals who take their cues from George Soros are fond of slandering evangelical Christians, using words intended to conjure in people's minds images of Christians torturing innocent gay children. These ludicrous attacks are unconscionably aimed at good and honest men, even guys like Vice President Mike Pence. And the slander is repeated so often by a complicit media that people start believing it. All this because guys like Pence and others have moral views which don't fit well in the liberal places Congressman O'Rourke likes to hang out. The idea that Mike Pence won't be alone with a woman who is not his wife makes progressives squirm. How dare he be so unfair to those other women? But I'm going to tell you something. These are just the kind of moral views that Hollywood and Washington could use a hell of a lot more of right now. And I'll tell you what we don't need more of in this country. We don't need more slimy, dishonest attacks that the Democrats have been using to keep good and decent men out of public office and off the Supreme Court. Okay, up next was the issue of the Second Amendment. Again, this is one of those places where you gave a good answer, but giving a good answer is not all there is to it. And this is true pretty much anytime you deal with a really emotional issue. Representative O'Rourke ended his answer with this line: "Weapons of war belong on the battlefield." When your opponent has a good line like that, it's probably best to begin your response by hitting back on that line hard. You probably needed to tie weapons of war to previous language that Democrats have used to try to take Texans' guns away. Words like assault rifle, which have no definable meaning other than the emotional content. You needed to point this out and convince your audience that the language Beto O'Rourke was using was the same kind of language used by gun control advocates in the past to take away gun rights. So I think you missed something there by not starting off that way. You had a different idea, and it wasn't a bad one. You wanted to start off by connecting emotionally over these shootings, and that's a good place to start. But this is how you did it. You said, you know, all of us have been horrified by these school shootings. Again, not a bad idea, terrible implementation. It's not all of us have been horrified. It's I was horrified. All of us have been horrified by these shootings is dismissive. I was horrified by the Santa Fe shooting. That is an emotional connection, and that's how you need to do it. And this would effectively go to where you wanted to go with your answer, because you wanted to talk about how you were right there on the ground after the shooting, talking to students. And so that kind of I was horrified is a much better way to go. After this, you did a pretty good job, though. You talked about how gun control is not the answer, and you talked about how you were getting that from the survivors themselves, which is always a good idea. You don't want to be the one telling the answers. You want the survivors to be the ones giving that answer. And on this particular point, the other line that you gave, you know, if you take our guns away, you're not going to make us any safer. That line right there was particularly good when coming from the mouths of the survivors. And that was a good way to set up your alternative answer, because your answer that you wanted to get to was armed police in schools. And that is a good position to take in opposition to the gun control advocates. But I think you could make that point a little bit more forcefully by saying something along the lines of, look, this isn't a problem that's going to be fixed by new government regulations. The right way to pursue security is not abandoning freedom. The right answer is having our police forces prioritize children's safety by stationing armed police officers at schools. Something along those lines would have been a little bit more effective way of making that particular point. I will say I don't have any criticism of the way you handled Beto's attack about thoughts and prayers. That was exquisite. Well done. All right. Let's get to the gotcha questions. This was not handled well. They started with your gotcha question about Donald Trump and your words with him. After being called out, the moderator basically called you out for flip-flopping on Trump, saying bad things about him before, him saying bad things about you, and then how you're now praising him. And the way you decided to go about this answer was to defend the honor of your dad and your wife against what Donald Trump had said about them. And then to follow that up with a commitment to work with Trump on the substance. Jobs was, I think, the way you put it. But that is not how you handle this. That was terrible. By arguing this way, you basically teed up Beto's response, and he got a home run swing against Donald Trump, and he hit it out of the park, quite honestly. He began by attacking Trump on tariffs and bringing up Russia collusion, and you walked right into it. And then that left you, because you were up first and he hit back, you only had 30 seconds for your follow-up response to defend Trump. And when you finally got here, you were on the right track. You pointed out that O'Rourke advocates impeachment, which is a radical idea that people are not going to be fond of. But if you had responded in the right way from the beginning, you could have done a much better job dealing with this gotcha question. And I'm going to show you exactly how I think you should have done it.
This question is for you, Senator Cruz. The last time you stood for election was in 2016. You were the runner-up in the Republican primary for president. You ran against then New York businessman Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as you remember, dubbed you Lion Ted. He took swipes at your wife and father. You, in turn, called him a pathological liar. And quite frankly, there are so many insults between the two of you, it would take the rest of this show to go through them all. But now that he's president, you guys have become friendly to the point where you praised him in Time magazine. How do you respond to critics who say that as it relates to President Trump, you've lost your dignity?
2016 was a monumental shift in American politics. An old political establishment was being tossed out on its heels in what was, quite honestly, an electrifying moment for grassroots democracy. In that fight, I was arguing that grassroots conservatives should elect someone with a long track record of conservatism to lead the way. Instead, American voters picked someone who was a complete outsider to Washington, who had no qualms about going an entirely new direction with the party. And look, I heavily disagreed with taking a gamble like that. But I also respect the voters' decision. And as it turns out, the voters were right. Donald Trump has put his money where his mouth is and accomplished things that many previous Republican presidents have promised but failed to do. He has stood up for the middle-class Americans in ways that no other president has. Now, I know it gives Democrats and the mainstream media an applause line whenever a conservative like me admits to a mistake. But I admit it. I was mistaken about Donald Trump. And as your senator, I promise to continue to oppose the Democratic Party's anti-American, anti-democratic attempt to undermine this duly elected president. Okay, on to Beto's gotcha question about his DUI. He gave an excellent response on this from the left's perspective. This was obviously something he had prepared for, and he gave a masterful answer. His argument was basically this: look, I'm thankful that I got a second chance, but I know that I got my second chance because of my white privilege, and that some minorities don't get the second chance that I got. And I think everyone deserves a second chance. This was a masterstroke. It was a flawless answer that he had obviously prepared for. He knew what he was going to say. And then it wasn't clear where you should go with that. Obviously, you can't attack him for his DUI, and so you're right to move from that to policy. But for some reason, you thought it was the moment to attack his stance on drugs, which had something to do with him advocating for a debate over the legalization of narcotics. This was a bad move on your part. Once again, there's nothing wrong with your position on drugs. You advocated libertarianism on marijuana or a states' rights kind of view where Colorado goes one way and Texas goes another. And that was a fine response to a question that was never asked. But it's not something that you want to harp on unless you are directly asked about it. Basically, the time to bring up states' rights libertarianism on marijuana is when a Democrat is accusing you of wanting to criminalize people for possession of marijuana. And that's when you go, no, I am libertarian. I like states' rights. And then by defending yourself from that charge, you make the accuser look like he was wrong. So he got the accusation wrong. And you also don't alienate either young voters who tend to be pro-marijuana or the old voters that tend to be against it. So that's the time when you come out with that kind of response. You don't go on the attack on that. You don't attack on that because then you risk turning Beto O'Rourke into the millennial hero, which I think he came across as, because such a large chunk of millennial voters are basically single-issue marijuana supporters, and you don't want to excite these people to come to the polls. Now, I realize I'm not giving you a correct answer here. I'm not exactly sure where you should have gone. You were right to avoid personal attacks, and you should have attacked policy with your allotted time. But I think making it about drugs was a mistake. Possibly attacking the white privilege angle and going cultural might have worked better. All right, question 7. And basically on questions 7 through 10, this is really where Ted Cruz, you hit your stride in the debate. Most of these answers were quite good, but I think there was just a couple places where I have a few helpful hints. First, on question 7 on healthcare, this is where you've shown, because you know exactly what you're talking about over the fight over Obamacare. You knew so much about the issue that you knew what Beto's answer would be, and so you undermined his response by saying we all agree on pre-existing conditions. And then when he came out with his anecdote about pre-existing conditions, you were able to come back at him and say, look, we already said we all agree. It was a masterful stroke there. And then you attacked him in just the right place, the skyrocketing premiums. Look what he's talking about. He's talking about pre-existing conditions, which I already agreed to. But what he doesn't want to talk about is premiums. Perfectly well played. I really have no complaints at all, especially when at the end of the debate you came back to this point and summed it up perfectly, saying Medicare for all, or what you are also calling socialized medicine, Medicare for all threatens your Medicare with bankruptcy. That is the perfect way to answer the question of healthcare for this particular election cycle. It's just brilliant. Question 8 was a very tricky question, and I think you handled it about as well as you could have, so I have no real criticism. It was about trade, and Trump is taking the party in a strange direction on trade. You want to look like you're working with him and all of that. It's just a really tricky situation. There's a lot of ways to get tripped up, and I think you came out of that question looking as good as possible because you got Beto to admit that he would work with Trump, which makes him look like he's trying to be you. Like, you obviously can work with Trump on trade without getting into the specifics of it. And then Beto was like, well, I can work with Trump. And so he looks like he's trying to take your position, which puts him in, I think, the worst possible light on this particular question. First, it's implausible that he would want to work with Trump, given the rhetoric that he said. So I don't think there was any way to come out of the trade question looking better than that. And I think that was part of the way the question was set up that helped you out there. But really, there's no getting away from the trade question better than you did on question 8. So moving on. Question 9 was on values. And you had a good response. You basically made your values Reagan-esque, small government, all that kind of stuff. And then you brought up Beto O'Rourke's out-of-state monetary support and his radicalism. And then After he got the chance to respond, he started talking about visiting all the counties. You called it a photo op and then claimed you were the one who was actually on the ground. Again, masterful, well done. I don't think I could have improved either the answer you initially gave or the retort. So well done on question 9. And that brings us finally to tax cuts, your last and final good answer. You harped on the fact that O'Rourke wants to raise taxes, and you gave many excellent, really good examples. My only critique here is that I think you missed a Reagan moment right at the end, because O'Rourke's response was to accuse you for the second time of working for lobbyists and special interests. He lobbed that bomb a question before, and then he brought it up again. And you can be heard chuckling on the microphone, but the camera wasn't on you, so it wasn't really effective. But I think what you should have said is something along the lines of "there you go again" as he was saying that. And then when he finished with his remark, if you could have snuck in something like a comedic line like, "Man, this guy sure knows how to make tax cuts and record economic growth sound sinister, doesn't he?" And I think that might have, or a line something like that, maybe one that's a little faster, could have been a nice little jab to add in there, kind of a Reagan moment. All right, this brings me to the final moment of the debate, complimenting your opponent. This is where things went terribly wrong. Ted Cruz, I'm sorry to say, but you failed at this point. Once again, I kind of knew where you were going. You were trying to compliment Beto's sincerity, just like he did for you, while simultaneously letting your audience know that his sincerity is kind of the naive sincerity of a radical socialist. But when you give someone a backhanded compliment like that, especially after they gave a good faith compliment toward you, you come off looking like a slimy politician. And you basically set Beto up for his final line, true to form. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think you should have played nice guy on this. I think you were right to attack. That was the right idea. But if you're going to do so, there's a way to do it where you don't come across as insincere. Let me show you how I think you could have accomplished this.
I want to make sure that, again, we're not giving away to corporations and special interests. That's what Senator Cruz would do, thanks to the contributions that he's received from those political action committees. He's working for the clampdown and the corporations and the special interests. He's not working for the people of Texas.
Representative O'Rourke, we'd like to end this for both of you on a very positive note, and we'd like to ask you to tell us something that you admire about your opponent.
Right. Senator Cruz and I were both elected to the United States Congress in the same year, 2012. We both have young children. I know how hard he works. I know how much time he has spent away from his kids. I know what a sacrifice that is to his family. I know that he's doing it for one reason. He wants to serve this country, and he's trying to do his best. We may have differences of opinions on what our destination might be and how we're going to get there. But I have no question that Senator Cruz wants to do the best for America. And he does so at great sacrifice to his family and to his kids. And so I thank you, Senator Cruz, for your public service.
Representative O'Rourke, I am so glad to hear you say that. Only a minute ago, you were claiming that I only care about the interests of rich people, that my conservative principles regarding low taxes and economic growth are somehow a sellout to corporate interests or lobbyists. And now you're saying that you believe that I make my decisions based on what I think is best for America. That is refreshing to hear, and I sincerely thank you for that. A few minutes ago, I likewise pointed out where your funding comes from, out-of-state lobbyists, Soros-affiliated groups, and so forth. But I'd like to say that I, too, believe you are sincere in your beliefs. I trust that you are advocating for what you think will work for America, and it is important that both sides of the aisle are willing to say that about each other. Our disagreements are about substantive matters, not whether or not we want what's best for America. And as Americans, I think all of us need to set aside questioning one another's motives. That means conservatives out there need to recognize that Bernie Sanders and other progressives really do think socialism can work for America. They are sincere in that belief. And for liberals out there as well, it means realizing that Donald Trump really is putting America first. I think all Americans could benefit from understanding, as Beto just indicated, that we are all in this together. All right, that's all I have, Ted. I hope you find this helpful when preparing for your next debate.